I'm Rachel Thompson, and for most of my life I was invisible. Not to strangers, not to friends, but to the people who were supposed to know me best, my family. I remember the night it all changed. I was 32 years old, sitting stiffly at my parents' mahogany dining table, surrounded by silver cutlery and crystal glasses. It was supposed to be a celebratory dinner. My brother Hakail had just gotten engaged to Jessica, a poised, lovely woman from a wealthy family. The table was full of laughter, the kind my mother perfected over decades of cocktail parties and social events. But behind her polished smile, I remained what I had always been to her, a footnote, an afterthought. That night, Jessica asked me a simple question, something no one in my family had ever really asked with genuine curiosity. "What do you do in New York, Rachel?" I opened my mouth to answer, but before I could, my mother's voice chimed in, light and dismissive. "She does something with books, a little publishing thing, I think." Jessica smiled politely, but I saw the flicker of confusion in her eyes. I felt the familiar burn of being minimized, but I didn't speak up. I'd learned long ago that defending myself in that house only made things worse. Jessica, to her credit, didn't drop it. She looked at me and asked, "What kind of books?" I gave the usual vague response. "Mostly literary fiction." My mother laughed. "Not that anyone would have heard of them, I'm sure. Rachel's always had her nose in books. Remember when we had to force her to go outside in the summer?" Everyone laughed. Everyone but Jessica. She kept looking at me, then quietly picked up her phone. I didn't think much of it until the room fell silent. She looked up, eyes wide, and said, "Rachel Thompson, the author?" My mother blinked. "What are you talking about?" Jessica turned her phone around, showing my author page on the Penguin Random House website. "She's won the National Book Critics Circle Award, her novels being turned into a film. She was in the New Yorker's 40 Under 40 list." The silence that followed was so thick it felt like the air had frozen. My father leaned forward. Michael stared. My mother snatched the phone. "This can't be right," she murmured. "It has to be a mistake." Jessica continued. "She wrote Beneath Silent Waters. Our book club read it. It was brilliant." I felt the breath catch in my throat. I had never imagined being outed like this in the middle of dinner, by someone I'd just met. Michael looked at me astonished. "Why didn't you tell us?" I laughed softly, bitterly. "I did. You just never listened." My mother shook her head. "No, we would have remembered something like this." I stared at her. "I sent you both signed copies. You put them in the guest room unopened. I told you when I got my first short story published, and you changed the subject to Michael's new job." My father's face fell. Jessica's face softened with sympathy. "Why would you hide all of this from your family?" my mother asked. "Because every time I tried to share something, it was dismissed," I said, voice cracking. "You always made it clear that Michael's accomplishments mattered. Mine were hobbies, distractions." Michael looked pained. "Rachel, I'm sorry. I didn't know." My mother still clutched the phone, scrolling through my bio, the accolades, the photos from award ceremonies, the press coverage. She looked like someone whose carefully constructed reality had just cracked. "Why didn't you make it clearer?" she whispered. I stood, my heart pounding. "Because it's not my job to beg you to see me. I've built a life, a successful, meaningful life, and none of you ever asked. You never wanted to know." Jessica reached out, touching my arm gently. "You should be proud. This is incredible." I looked at her, eyes stinging. Thank you. That means more than you know." That night, everything changed. The facade of our family dinner shattered. The daughter no one saw had finally been revealed, but not by her own voice, by a Google search. And still, in that awkward silence, I realized something that I hadn't dared hope for in years. Maybe, just maybe, they were finally starting to see me. The morning after that dinner, I woke in my childhood bedroom, a room that hadn't changed since I was 17. The floral wallpaper, the high school photos, the dusty bookshelf filled with the same worn paperbacks I once clung to like lifelines. They all made me feel like a ghost haunting a past that refused to acknowledge I'd ever left. My head was still spinning from the previous night, from Jessica's words, from the way my mother had clutched her phone, trying to reconcile the person on the screen with the girl she once told to go play outside when I stayed up late writing stories on the family computer. Downstairs, the house was quiet. I hesitated on the landing before descending, unsure of what version of my parents would greet me. My father was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of coffee, his back to me. When he turned, he looked startled, like he hadn't expected me to come down. "Mornin'," he said, voice low. "Mornin'." He gestured to the coffee pot. "Want some?" I nodded, and he poured me a mug. No one spoke for a long moment. Then he said, "I stayed up reading your book last night." My breath caught. "You did?" "Yeah," he said slowly. "It was powerful, raw, honest. He paused, as if unsure of how to continue. "I saw pieces of us in it." I looked at him carefully. That was never the goal, but I didn't know how else to process what I felt. He nodded. "I get that now." My mother didn't appear until mid-morning. She walked in with her usual briskness, wearing a pressed blouse and her signature tight smile. "I spoke with Marilyn Jenkins this morning," she said, as if resuming a previous conversation. "Her daughter teaches your book at Ohio State." I blinked, unsure how to respond. "She seemed very impressed," my mother added, almost awkwardly. "Said she'd give me a copy so I could follow along with her class." There it was again, this sideways admission of pride, filtered through the lens of social approval. I didn't say anything. I couldn't tell if I felt seen or simply displayed, but it was a start. Over the following weeks, something subtle shifted. Michael started calling me more often, not just to check in, but to ask questions about my work. Real questions. He read my books, made notes, asked if certain characters were inspired by people we both knew. Jessica texted regularly, sometimes just to send a quote from a story she liked. And my father, he began reading every article with my byline, even the older ones I'd long forgotten. One day he called just to say, "That last piece in the Atlantic made me think about your grandfather. He never talked much about the war, but I wonder now how many things he kept buried." My mother was slower, more hesitant. At dinner one night, she asked, "Are you working on anything new?" Her voice was carefully casual. I told her yes, and she nodded, not asking for more. But a few days later, I found her in the guest room flipping through a printed galley of my second novel. She didn't say anything when I walked in, just looked up and said, "I didn't know words could hurt so beautifully." At Jessica and Michael's engagement party, things reached a kind of crescendo. I was asked formally, this time to do a reading. My mother didn't object. In fact, she arranged the seating so that I'd be at the main table. She even had the caterers print a little program listing me as Rachel Thompson, author. When I stood at the podium, the garden lit by strings of fairy lights, I looked into a crowd that included not only strangers and friends, but also the people who had once treated my voice like background noise. I read a scene from my latest manuscript, a moment between two sisters, one loud and golden, the other quiet and sharp-edged. It wasn't subtle. I wasn't trying to be. When I finished, there was applause. Real, warm, sustained applause. My father stood first. Michael followed. Even my mother clapped, her eyes glassy. Afterward, she pulled me aside. "You have a gift," she said softly. "I didn't see it before. I see it now." Her words weren't perfect, but they didn't have to be. For the first time in my life, she was speaking to me not the idea of me, not the role I was supposed to play, but me. That night, I left the party not with fireworks or a sense of triumph, but with something deeper, a quiet relief, a peace I hadn't known I was waiting for. The Rachel who had walked into that house invisible had finally been seen. Not by everyone, not completely, but enough. And sometimes enough is everything. 3 weeks later, I received an email from Columbia University. They were inviting me to speak at their Creative Writing Symposium, an event I had once attended as a hopeful undergraduate, scribbling notes in the back row. Now they wanted me as the keynote speaker. I stared at the screen for a long moment before responding. It felt surreal. The girl who had once been told her stories were a nice little hobby was now being asked to inspire the next generation of writers. I forwarded the email to Michael on a whim. He replied within 10 minutes. "This is incredible. I'm so proud of you. Can I come?" That short message undid something in me I hadn't even realized was still knotted. I told him yes, of course. I didn't expect him to actually show up. But on the day of the symposium, as I adjusted the mic and scanned the packed auditorium, I saw him in the third row, next to Jessica, both smiling. I spoke for 30 minutes about invisibility, about using pain as fuel, about building a voice in silence. The crowd was generous. The standing ovation at the end didn't feel like a reward, it felt like recognition. And afterward, when Michael hugged me and whispered, "I had no idea you could do that," I realized that maybe I hadn't either. Back in Brooklyn that night, I sat at my desk and stared at the blinking cursor. My next novel was stalled, half-formed ideas, messy outlines, and not a single chapter that felt like it belonged. For the first time in years, I felt unsure. I had built my career in the quiet, out of sight, protected from their gaze. Now that the curtain had lifted, could I still write with the same clarity? Or would their new attention change me? 2 days later, my mother called. "I read the second book," she said without preamble. "Twice." I waited. "It made me uncomfortable," she continued. "The scene with the mother who dismisses the daughter's art." Her voice broke off. "I'm not saying it's me. I'm saying it felt like it could have been." I didn't respond immediately. I wanted to tell her it wasn't her, that the character was a composite, that I wasn't trying to wound her, but I also didn't want to lie. "I didn't write it about you," I said eventually, "but I wrote it from a place you helped create." She was quiet for a long moment. "I see." I thought she might hang up. Instead, she said, "What are you writing now?" And for the first time in my life, I told her the truth, not a vague answer or a deflection, but the actual premise, the themes, the struggle I was facing. She didn't offer feedback or suggestions. She just listened. A few nights later, I got an email from her. She had sent me a scanned photo of a crayon drawing I made at age 6, a little girl standing in front of a bookshelf, arms raised in triumph. You always knew who you were, the note read. I'm sorry it took me so long to see her. That email became the title of my new manuscript. Things didn't change overnight. There were still awkward pauses on calls. Still moments where she didn't quite know how to talk to me as someone real and whole. But there was effort, and there was space now for both of us to be more than the roles we'd played for so long. At the end of that month, I received a letter in the mail, a physical letter, written in my father's precise, slightly slanted handwriting. He told me he'd reread my first book and was keeping a notebook of thoughts and questions. Not critiques, he clarified, reflections. He had never written me a letter before, not one. It felt like a bridge being built across decades of distance. Michael and Jessica invited me to a small dinner at their new condo the next weekend. When I arrived, Michael greeted me with a stack of books in his hands. We're building our library, he said, and we figured we should start with your work. He looked sheepish. I had to buy extra copies. Jessica keeps loaning them out to people. We spent the evening eating pasta and talking about stories. Not just mine. Jessica was rereading Toni Morrison. Michael had picked up a Murakami novel. It was the first time I felt like I belonged in a family conversation, not because I was being humored or pitied, but because they genuinely wanted to know what I thought. For years, I had been the ghost in the room, present but unacknowledged. Now I was real, and not just to them, to myself. That night, as I walked home through the soft chill of early spring, I thought about how strange healing could be. It didn't arrive in grand gestures or perfect apologies. It came in small invitations, awkward phone calls, saved drawings, scribbled notes, and imperfect attempts to connect. And somehow that made it more honest, more durable. For the first time, I wasn't just the invisible daughter or the reluctant storyteller. I was Rachel. Fully, finally, seen. 3 weeks after that quiet dinner at Michael's condo, I received an invitation in the mail, an actual ivory cardstock envelope with embossed lettering that felt oddly formal given how far we'd come. Inside was a neatly printed card. You are cordially invited to a private celebration in honor of Rachel Thompson, author, sister, daughter. The event would be hosted at my parents' home. My first instinct was disbelief. A part of me was convinced it was a mistake, that perhaps Jessica had gone overboard and my mother would be mortified. But then I saw my father's name at the bottom, not in print, but signed in ink. I hadn't realized how much I needed to see that until it was there. I stared at the card for a long time before I allowed myself to feel anything. The idea of being celebrated in the house where I had so often been ignored felt both exhilarating and terrifying. What if it was performative? What if they couldn't follow through? But another voice, one that had grown louder in recent months, whispered, "What if they're trying?" On the night of the event, I arrived in a dark green dress, simple but elegant. One that Eleanor had once told me made me look like a woman who knows her worth. I parked at the curb and watched the lights glowing from the windows of the house where so much of my history still lived. Then I stepped out and walked up the path, unsure of what version of myself I would need to be once I crossed the threshold. My father answered the door. He was wearing a navy suit and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before. Pride, yes, but also something gentler, more personal. "You're here," he said. "Of course I'm here," I replied. "You invited me." He smiled and stepped aside to let me in. Inside, the house had been rearranged not in a grand way, but with a kind of quiet intention. My framed book covers had been printed and hung along the hallway walls, interspersed with family photos. A table in the living room displayed copies of my novels next to a sign that read, "Please take one," signed by the author. There was a guest list of about 30 people, neighbors, old family friends, even Mrs. Landry, my high school English teacher, who hugged me and whispered, "Told you you'd make it." My mother was in the kitchen, arranging canapes with more focus than usual. When she saw me, she didn't hug me, but she did say, "You look lovely." And then she added, "There's a seat for you at the head table next to me." I hadn't sat next to her at any event since I was a child. I nodded and thanked her, unsure if I should say more. But she reached out and touched my arm, a quiet gesture that carried more weight than any apology. During dinner, my father stood to make a toast. He wasn't a speech giver by nature, but his voice was steady. "Most of you know Rachel as our daughter," he began. "Some of you know her as the little girl who always had her nose in a book. Tonight, we want to honor the woman she's become, a voice in literature, a voice for those who've ever felt unseen." I looked down at my plate, unable to meet the eyes suddenly turned toward me. "Rachel," he said, "we didn't always understand what you were building, but we see it now, and we're proud. Truly." There was a soft murmur of approval from the guests, but what mattered most was the way my father looked at me. Not as a daughter who'd strayed from the expected path, but as someone worth honoring on her own terms. After the toast, Michael stood and clinked his glass. "I've had the privilege of watching my sister become who she was always meant to be," he said. "And if any of you still haven't read her books, what are you waiting for? Seriously, they'll wreck you in the best way." Laughter followed, warm and easy. Then Jessica took a turn. "The thing about Rachel's writing," she said, "is that it sees you. Not just the polished, performative version you show the world, but the soft, bruised parts you try to hide. Her words don't just fill pages, they find you. And they stay." The room was quiet after that. No applause, just a stillness that felt reverent. Later that evening, as the crowd thinned and guests began to say their goodbyes, my mother approached me with a small box in her hands. "This was yours," she said. "I found it in the attic last week." Inside was the story I had written at age 8, the one about the girl who could talk to animals. It was stained, yes, but still intact. My name was written in big block letters on the top page. "I read it," she added. "All of it. You've always had something special." For the first time in my life, I believed she meant it. I thanked her and placed the box gently in my bag, feeling like I had recovered a piece of myself that had long been lost. When I left that night, my father walked me to my car. "Will you let us know when the next book comes out?" he asked. "I wanted to pre-order it." I laughed. "I'll send you an early galley," I promised. "With your name on the dedication page, maybe." He looked surprised, then moved closer and hugged me. "That would mean more than you know." As I drove home through the dark, empty roads, I realized something. I no longer needed my family's validation to feel real. But now that it was being offered freely, without conditions, I could receive it without pain. That was the difference. I had built my identity without them. Now they were slowly learning how to love me without reshaping me. It wasn't perfection, but it was progress. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel like a visitor in my own story. I felt like I belonged. As I drove back to New York that Sunday evening, the road stretched endlessly before me, but for once the miles felt lighter. The silence inside the car was no longer the weight of things unsaid, but rather a space in which peace could finally settle. I glanced at the passenger seat where the note from my father rested beside the galley copy of my newest novel. His words had lingered in my mind all day, circling gently like soft birds returning home. Your words are beautiful. They matter. You matter. It had taken decades, countless missed chances, and a single dinner that cracked the surface, but now things were beginning to shift. My mother wasn't magically transformed, not yet. But even her smallest gestures inviting me to table one, introducing me to guests as Rachel the author, complimenting my hair meant more than she probably realized. They were beginnings, and beginnings, however tentative, always carried possibility. I thought about my brother too, Michael, once the golden boy, now reaching across the divide with sincerity and humility I hadn't expected. Our conversation before I left had been simple, but profound. "Let's not let it fade," he had said, hugging me tightly. "Not again." And I had promised, just as tightly, we won't. Back in Brooklyn, I opened the window of my apartment to the late spring breeze. The city's pulse, once a lonely thrum in my early years here, now felt like an echo of my own heartbeat, familiar, comforting, real. I placed the framed note from my father on the shelf next to my Penn Faulkner Award and the signed first edition of Beneath Silent Waters. Not because I needed it to prove anything, but because it finally belonged there. Because he had seen me now, really seen me. And that mattered. The next morning, I received a message from Jessica. She had sent me a photo from the engagement party. I was standing at the podium, mid-sentence, eyes lifted slightly, hands open as if releasing something into the air. Behind me, strung lights twinkled like stars. Underneath the image, she had written, "Powerful. Thank you for sharing your voice with us." I stared at the photo for a long moment. It wasn't just about being visible anymore. It was about being understood, heard. And now, with each word I continued to write, I knew I wasn't writing to prove anything, not to my family, not to critics, not even to myself. I was writing because the stories needed to be told, because someone out there, some invisible daughter or overlooked son, might read my work and feel seen for the first time. Later that week, I walked past a bookstore in Manhattan and saw my book displayed in the front window. A young woman stood there, reading the back cover with interest. She picked it up, flipped through a few pages, and smiled softly before carrying it to the register. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. I walked on, heart full. Sometimes the most profound transformation doesn't happen in sudden fireworks, but in the slow, quiet unraveling of old narratives. And when the dust settles, what remains is something stronger, truer, and impossibly more beautiful than what came before. I had not only become a writer, I had become seen. And in the gentle light of that visibility, I could finally stop shrinking.